Hey, what's up guys, Red Bishop here, and welcome back to another video review. This time it is for a game called Voodoo Vince Remastered, and as you can tell by the title of the game, it is a remastered of the 2003 original Xbox game, Voodoo Vince, developed by Beep Industries, and some of the original developers and the original creator have come back to do this remastered version. And for those who have played the original 2003 version, gameplay-wise, you know, it is very similar. As a matter of fact, it is almost one-to-one with the original. And for those who are new to it, who have not played it, it is released now on the Xbox One and Windows 10. It is an Xbox Play Anywhere game, so if you buy it on either of those, you own it on both. $15. The actual gameplay, it's one of those early 2000s, you know, 3D platformers where the controls are real tight. The actual combat is probably the simplest of it. And then the platforming sections are pretty easy when you first start out, and then they get progressively harder as you get towards the end. And towards the end of that game, which I'll talk about a little later, it definitely ramps up on difficulty when it comes to the platforming. But the actual gameplay, the story, let's get to the story first. It starts out where you're obviously a voodoo doll named Vince, and your creator gets captured, and your whole goal of the game is to try to find her and free her from her captors. And so with this happening, you go to different areas. You go to a sausage factory. You gotta help this professor create a plane. It's kind of, you know, one of those weird over-the-top video game stories where it makes no sense, but when you're playing it, it's fun to play and go through all these different areas. Go through the square to try to help this jazz man find his trumpet. Outside of the game, none of this would make any sense, but when you're actually playing the game, they kind of set up the missions and the story and everything in a very good manner. And you can also tell it's an early 2000s game just by the way the levels and everything are set up. They're kind of small, they're kind of contained into one thing, and then you kind of morph to a different area when you're done. So like each mission will have a few objectives. There's one where you have to try to get this jazz man, not necessarily give him his trumpet like I said earlier, but you have to try to find the trumpet, play a good song for him to unlock the gate to get to the next area. And inside of this area, you have to feed a horse an apple, and then it kicks you up to a clock. And then you change the time on the clock to go buy the trumpet. Like I said, without seeing any of the gameplay you're seeing, just makes no sense. It feels like I'm talking about, a bunch of gibberish. But the actual gameplay itself is set up in a way where you have a punch on X, you have a swinging, basically you'll put your feet in the air and swing around on B, and then as you progress through the game, you'll find these little idols that will give you the ability to basically do a super. When you pull in both triggers and you have a skull filled up in the top right corner, you pull both triggers and you basically do a super move. And there are a crap ton of them. There's some where he's running with scissors, the scissors fall on him, because basically whenever Voodoo Vince gets damage to himself, or a big amount of damage to himself, it will hurt the enemies around him. You'll find that out in boss fights. You'll find that out in these supers. There's some where he's in an outhouse and he's got to go to the bathroom, and when he gets done going to the bathroom, it kills all the enemies in the surrounding area. And that, to me, kind of the humor of it, some of them fall flat. There's so many of them, not all of them are going to be hits. But some of them are really funny, and there's a good variety of them to where, for the most part, you don't see a ton of them duplicated throughout the game. And to get the skulls I'm talking about in the top right, you start out with, I think, at least 2 of them. You may only start out with 1. But to get more of those, there are voodoo cards in each level. Once you collect all those voodoo cards, a skull will appear, and you have to then try to catch it to unlock the next skull so you can have more super moves and stuff like that. And then there are these voodoo bags that they call that are hidden throughout the level. They're little collectibles. You'll see it in the video. That when you collect 100 of those, every 100 you collect gives you another blip on your health meter, which that comes big into play because when you're fighting the bosses or fighting these enemies, obviously the more health you have, the better. But to counter that, when you actually go into certain areas, certain enemies are not really, like the combat itself is, for the most part, not very difficult. You can kind of defeat certain enemies without really any difficulty at all. But then there are certain areas where, like, Voodoo Vince cannot touch water. If he touches water, he's dead. So it kind of defeats the purpose for me anyway of getting some of those bags, because instead of hitting the water and just losing some health and it kicking you back out to the mainland or kicking you out to where you are, you die immediately. Like, your health is gone, you lose a life. Once you lose all your lives, you go back to the main menu, you load in the previous level, and you start that level over. For the most part, some of them have it, but for the most part, most levels don't have individual checkpoints inside of the level. So you have to do all the objectives to advance. If you don't do them and you lose all your lives, you'll be kicked out to the main menu and have to redo them. But there are plenty of hearts inside of each level, so for the most part, that won't be an issue for everybody. It wasn't a huge issue for me. It's only really got an issue towards the end of the game. And when it comes to the actual boss fights, it goes underneath that trope of boss fights in the early 2000s, kind of up to today, where once you hit a boss 3 times or do something to a boss 3 times, that boss is then defeated. And none of the boss fights themselves are super difficult or require a whole lot of thinking. When it comes to like individual puzzles, like I said, most of the levels have objectives you have to do, which do require you to do some puzzles, but it's not a puzzle platformer, I would say. It's more of just a straight 3D platformer with individual objectives in each level. It's a kind of like a smaller version of a Banjo-Kazooie, not with all the collectibles you have to do, but just with the objectives inside of each level, I would say. The actual ending of the game, which I won't spoil anything for those who have never played the game, even though it is a, 14-year-old game almost by now. The ending gets a little frustrating because they try to tie in all the platforming. You unlock eventually a way to swing, kind of like a grappling hook mechanic, sort of. And they try to tie all that in to the very last level, and it becomes a frustrating end of the game because up to this point, I felt like the controls themselves were tight, the gameplay and the combat was pretty good. But then when they throw all of it together, it almost becomes kind of a jumbled mess for me because you have to try to do the swinging, then you have to try to jump, and you have to try to land on a platform. And it's not that it's difficult. It's just sometimes those mechanics won't register. There have been times in this game throughout my whole time playing it, and it took me about 6.5, 7 hours to finish it. Doing the double jump sometimes would not register for me. And this is even more frustrating at the end because when you're fighting a particular enemy, or not fighting a particular enemy, when you're trying to climb a particular enemy, it's a very tall robot. When you're trying to climb that, if you miss a jump, you fall all the way to the ground, and you have to climb all the way back up. There's no, checkpoint there. And, again, if you lose all your lives or something happens and you die, and you have to restart this level, you have to start it all the way back over again. There's no, hey, I climbed halfway to the tower. Oh, it saves for me. No. I mean, that's just how the game is, obviously. That's how they designed it, so that you can't get too upset about it. But that particular mechanics all thrown together at the end became a frustrating thing. But up to that point, I enjoyed the game. I liked what I was playing. I just thought the ending itself, the ending last level and a half, was just frustrating. And to be fair, looking back now, when I played that game originally 14 years ago, it was also frustrating then. It just didn't come back to me until I was playing through it again. But that's going to probably do it for the video review. Like I said, up until that last level, controls feel great. I like the gameplay. I like the fact they keep adding new moves, and they kept adding new voodoo figures for you to get these supers. The enemies themselves are not too difficult. The bosses themselves are unique enough, and even though they all go on that same trope of hit them 3 times and they're dead, they're still unique enough, and the way that you fight them is actually pretty cool because it's not one of those things where you keep failing over and over and over and over, so you got to figure out, oh, well, I already know what he's going to do. You see it once, and then you kind of move on to the next level. Overall, the story and the writing is kind of hit or miss. It depends on your sense of humor. I personally found most of it to be enjoyable, but that's obviously, humor is very subjective. For $15, I would recommend it because it's an original Xbox game that they're bringing back that was fun on the original Xbox. It still holds up as a 3D platformer today, so I would recommend people pick it up. You can play it on both the Xbox and your PC if you do buy it. Thanks for watching this video review. Hope you enjoyed, and have a good one.